just reminding you of who we are, the new Water Council support team from the Georgia Water Planning and Policy Center. And I'm listing all of our folks that are supporting councils, including Megan Taylor, Catherine Zitch, Sarah Skinner, Mark Masters, and Gail Cowie. And then Nikki Dixon and myself, we're doing some more general support for the councils across the state. Please reach out to us if you have any questions after the webinar. Next slide, please. So just reminding you that we've set up these webinars to give you a chance to learn about some background materials on some of the water issues that you are coming into contact with as water planners yourselves, as members of the council. We are recording them if you want to watch them later, or you know someone who might want to watch them later, and we will send that link to you and future communications to council members. While I'm on this slide, on the right-hand side, there's a link to the council member survey, which we are concluding this week. If you haven't done it yet, there's a link right there with the QR code you can use. I believe that Nikki also sent it out earlier this week to you via a constant contact email. So we hope that you'll finish that. We've gotten a good response rate, but we still have some more folks we need to hear from in order to make sure we know the best way to keep in touch with you. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so today's webinar is about population projections. For those of you that are council members that have been with us for a while, you've encountered the population's projections in each water planning cycle that you've been a part of. The population projections are the basis for projecting future water and wastewater demands. And water and wastewater demands are central to how we plan, how the regional water plans are built in order to assess relative to our water resources. Do we have enough water? Do we have the quality of water do we need? We also need to know how much water and wastewater we'll have in the future. And we've projected those out anywhere from a 40 to 50 year planning cycle in the previous planning rounds, and expect we're looking at the same thing in the forthcoming round. We are also forecasting on a number of other factors in addition to the population projections, some of which relate directly to population projections, permitted water withdrawals and discharges, audit data from utilities, estimates of the self-serve population for wells and septic systems, per capita water use estimates, and input from councils and the utilities on both the population projections and the forecasts. The population projections are prepared by the Vinson Institute at the University of Georgia for the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget. And our speaker today, Taylor Hafley, is from the Vinson Institute. I'm going to introduce him in just a minute. Next slide, please. This is just to remind you of where we're coming from. These, and Taylor's going to dig into this in detail, but we have had population projections for each cycle of regional water planning, and here you can see those for the previous 2 cycles. And so next year we will be adding another line here to project forward to support the next round of planning. Next slide. And to give you a sense of the process, in the past we've brought the population projections to the councils after they're ready, and we're starting earlier this time. We're starting today by talking with you about the methods. In the fall, we're going to have some joint council meetings at which we will look together at the 2025 population estimates and get your input on those. In the spring of 2026, we will use new estimates that will be developed in 2026 that will form the basis for water and wastewater forecasts in the next round of planning. And so we're going to have a trial run in the fall to gather input on the current or the current year's forecast of population, get your input, and then have the final ones produced and shared with you in the spring. Next slide, please. Okay, we can move on now to Taylor's presentation. Any questions before we get started? All right, Taylor Hafley is an applied demographer at the University of Georgia's Vinson Institute of Government. His demographic research and data analysis supports state agencies and local governments as a part of Workforce and Economic Development Division. He has a PhD in geography from the University of Georgia, an MA in geography from the University of Denver, and a BA in geography and political science from Wittenberg University. And really glad Taylor has offered to start working with the councils early in this process, and is going to share with you some information today on current population trends, as well as the methods that are used in population projections that the council makes use of. Taylor?
Thanks, Kristen. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining. I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in and talk about some of the demographics, and then we'll have some time to answer questions at the end. And then also we may have a few questions for y'all depending on how what kind of questions y'all ask us. I'm joined by a couple of my colleagues who are online as well, Breon Haskett and Ashley Zignook, who are both members of our team at the Carl Vinson Institute of Government. So the outline for today is I'm going to give you a little bit of background on what the demographic trends are in Georgia, and how things have changed recently. Then I'll talk about the components of population change specifically as a way to kind of lean into the population projection method and how we do those, and then there'll be time for questions. So first question is, or first slide is a little bit of trivia. You can answer in the chat if you want, or you can just see what you think, and you don't have to turn your mic on or anything. But what is the current population of Georgia? Okay, for those who guessed B, 11.18 million, you're the lucky winners for today. I want to give you a little bit of background on the U.S. as a whole. The U.S. Census Bureau published population projections for the United States last fall, or the fall of 2023. And in those projections, they projected that by the end of the second half of the 21st century, that the U.S. population would peak. And so I'm going to get into a little bit of why that's going on, but that's a little bit of the background, is that around 2080, we'd hit around 365 million people, and then that would be the peak. So we look at Georgia's population over the last 120 years. You can see that Georgia's population, we had about 2 million people in 1900, and by 2020, we had 10.7 million people. So in the 2020 census, we had 10.7 million people. That made us the 8th largest state in the country. If you look at this graph a little more detail, you can see that between 1970 and 2010, Georgia's population more than doubled. So we saw some pretty dramatic growth in this period. These first 70 years of this century, we grew by about 2.5 million. And then between 1970 and 2010, we grew by 5 million. And in particular, in the 90s and 2000s, the state grew by over 3 million people, which is about 1.5 million people per decade. It was around 25% in the 90s and around 17 or 18% in the 2000s. In the most recent decade, the full decade between the 2010 census and the 2020 census, our population slowed down just a little bit. We were at 9.6 million in 2010, and then again about 10.7. So we increased by right around 1 million people, and grew at about 10%. That was the slowest rate of growth that we'd seen in several decades, but that was not unique to Georgia alone. So if we put Georgia in the context, we were one of only 4 states to grow by 1 million people in the 2010s. You can see that here. The other 3 states are California, Texas, and Florida. And then if we look at that as a rate of growth, so I said Georgia increased at about 10.5%. That was faster than the country as a whole. The country as a whole grew at around 7.5%, which was the slowest rate of growth since the 1930s. So there's some similarities coming out of the Great Depression of 1929, as there is coming out of the Great Recession of 2007, 8, 9, at least in its correlation with population growth. So just to kind of summarize this, Georgia's growth in the 2010s outpaced the national average. So even though it was slower for us, we were still growing faster than the rest of the country. We're the 13th fastest growing state, and one of only 4 states where the population increased by more than 1 million people. Since the 2020 census, Georgia's population has increased by around 470,000 people. So when we had 10.7 in 2020, we're at about 11.18 million according to the 2024 estimates. So those are that date is July 1st, 2024. So over that 4-year plus period, we increased by roughly 115, 120,000 people per year. Just to put that in context, I said we were the 13th fastest in the 2010s. Well, in the 2020s, we've been the 12th fastest growing state. So this is looking at percent growth. So we've grown by about 4%. You can see a place like Idaho has grown by almost 10%, but Idaho only has 2 or 3 million people, so it's easier to grow faster. Whereas Florida and Texas are still growing quite fast. And they're also very large. If we look numerically, we can see that just as in the 2010s, Georgia has experienced the 4th largest numeric increase since 2020. So we've grown by about 467,000 people behind Texas, Florida, and California. Texas, Florida, and North Carolina instead of California in this case. If we look at the geography of this growth, here we can look at in the 2010s, the fastest growing counties was Bryan County, which is here down on the coast. That's where the Hyundai plant is near Savannah. Forsyth County, north of Atlanta, grew 43%. And then we have some places right outside of Athens where we're located, Oconee, Jackson County, and then Columbia County around Augusta that were growing the fastest. During the 2010s, Bryan County was the 6th fastest growing county in the state. Notably, when we talk about rates, it's very important to think about the size of the population, though. So Bryan County had about 30,000 people in 2010, and so to grow by about 50% means they had about 45,000 people in 2020. If we look post 2020, you can see that the trends are pretty similar. Bryan County isn't the fastest, instead it's long here, but it's still kind of along the coast. And then we still see places, instead of Forsyth growing, it's Dawson County's growing a little faster just to the north. But still we see Jackson County and really kind of this suburban Atlanta and coastal Georgia up into the Georgia mountains are our fastest growing regions. If we look numerically in the 2010s, you can see that really the largest population growth was in the places with the largest populations. This isn't necessarily surprising. Gwinnett has roughly 1 million people that live there. So to increase by 150,000 says it's grown about 12-15%. Whereas, if you think of a place like Tolliver County, if it was to grow by, 150 people, that would be a lot of growth in Tolliver County, which is the smallest populated county in the state. And then if we look at this and numerically compared to the post-2020 period, you can see that we see some pretty similar trends. So Gwinnett County is has grown the most, Forsyth County second most, but really it's this Metro Atlanta. The top 12 here are all Metro Atlanta counties that are growing the fastest or have grown by the most. And then Chatham County here, which is Savannah, is right behind that. So one thing about Georgia's population is that it's really concentrated. So I said we had around 11 million people. Roughly a third of the people in Georgia live in just 4 counties. That's Cobb, Fulton, DeKalb, and Gwinnett. So around 3.5 million people live there. And then another third of Georgians live in these light blue counties, which are really, we can think of as the suburban Atlanta area. Then also a place like Athens, or then what some folks call hub communities. So this would be like Dalton and Whitfield County. This would be Columbus, Valdosta, Savannah. This would be Macon and Warner Robins, and this would be Augusta. And so another third of Georgians live there, which means that in these other 134 counties, roughly another third of Georgians live there. So when you see maps of Georgia, there's as much going on in these 3 counties as there is in all the gray counties in terms of the population distribution. Now, we've talked a lot about growth so far. On the flip side of that is that 68 counties lost population between 2010 and 2020. So these are these counties that are in the darker colors, lost population. This is not new. If we go back to 2000, you can actually see that these 43 counties in red have fewer people in 2020 census than they did in the 2000 census. So this is a couple decades of population loss in several of these counties. Now, one thing that can perhaps lead you a conclusion you could potentially reach here is, we see how concentrated the population is in some of Metro Atlanta counties, is to say that all urban areas are growing, all rural areas are declining. That's not necessarily true. One thing to note is that there's no single definition of rural. So depending on which federal agency or state you're in, they might have a different definition of rural. In Georgia and at the Institute of Government, what we use is if a county has less than 50,000 people, it's considered rural. That is what the Georgia General Assembly uses. And so if we use that definition, you can see these counties here in teal are still considered rural, meaning they have less than 50,000 people today. But since 1990, so over 3 decades, they've experienced population growth of more than 50%. So in places like this, while many rural areas are losing population and thinking about how do we, attract folks here or maintain our tax base, et cetera, there are also many rural counties that still are relatively small, have still relatively small populations, but are dealing with some population growth and thinking about schools and roads and water and those sorts of things. So we look out ahead. These are the latest round of projections from 2024, which you can see in gray here. These are the observed and historical numbers. And then the projections are that we'll grow by about 1 million people in the 2020s, another million in the 2030s, and then slightly less in the 2050s. If we look at that as rates of growth, we can see that the rate of growth is projected to slow down a little bit. So this is in part related because the denominator is getting smaller or getting larger, so it's just harder to grow by as fast when you as the number of Georgians we have are in the state. But you can see that it's 10% in the 2020s, 8, 5, 4 through the 2050s. Now, to compare that to those national projections I showed you at the very beginning, these are the projected rates for the U.S. as a whole. Is that they'll grow the U.S. as a whole will grow about 4%, 3%, and then 1%. So even though our rate of growth is slowing, we're still projected to outpace the U.S.'s growth rate. So now you're probably wondering, okay, well, how did populations change and how do you project these things? What goes into this? Well, there's 3 components of population change. The only way that the population is going to change between today and tomorrow in the world is births. That's how we add population, and deaths. That's how we subtract population. And now if we think about, then if we draw a border around either a county or a state or city, or country, then people can move in and out, and that's our 3rd component of population change. So I'm just going to step through each of these and show you what those trends are unfolding in the state of Georgia. So if we look from 2000 to 2023, we can see that the number of births have been falling since about 2007, when we had a peak number of births of 151,000 births in the state of Georgia. In 2007 and 2023, we had about 125,000 births. And then in 2000, we had 132,000 births. So note that even if we compare 2023 to 2000, there were about 7,500 fewer births, even though there were about 3 million fewer Georgians in 2000 than today. This has an impact on several things, specifically our education and workforce is one thing we think a lot about here at the Institute of Government. And so I've just flipped this line chart to a bar chart. And if we add 18 years, we can think of that as peak number of births in 2007 as our high school class of 2025. So we would anticipate that to be the peak number of high school students in the state of Georgia, just based off this simple metric. Of course, people under the age of 18 can move in and out and can shift this a little bit, but this is also the peak number of births in the U.S. and what higher ed experts anticipate is the largest high school class nationally for the foreseeable future. So Georgia is very much on par with the rest of the country as a whole in seeing this trend. We can already see this playing out at the K through 12 level. So if we compare 2023 to 2013 fall enrollments, and aggregate those up to the regional education service areas, which are a DOE boundary, you can see that many regions throughout the state have already seen a decline in their K through 12 enrollments. At the same time, there are also some regions, particularly Northeast Georgia and the coast, that have seen some increase in enrollment. So this is kind of, these patterns are uneven and not uniform everywhere you go. So the question you might be asking yourself is what is driving this? And what's impacting this decline in births? So I'm going to compare this 2007 number to this 2023 number by age groups. So what we have along the x-axis here across the bottom is the age group of women when they have children. So, and along the y-axis is the number of children born to those women. So women ages 19 and under had almost 20,000 births in 2007. Women ages 20 to 24 had around 40,000. Women ages 25 to 29 had around 40,000. And then 30 to 34, around 30,000, etc. And remember, this is the peak number of births of 151,000. And then if we move forward to 2022, you can see that really the big decline is in births to teenage mothers. So a decline of roughly 15,000 fewer babies here. And same for women ages 20 to 24, roughly a decline of 15,000, which is 30,000, which explains most of the decline. And then we can actually see women ages 30 and older all had more births or more children than they did in 2007, which was the peak. And just to show you that this is a consistent trend, this is the 2023 data. So there was a slight uptick in 2023, and you can see that it's really all out here on this part of the curve. What we see is, in terms of population growth, why this matters to us is if you have your first child in your early 20s, you may have 2 or 3 or 4 kids. If you have your first child at age 35, you may only have 1 or 2 kids. And so you have smaller family sizes, and therefore you have slower population growth through natural change. Now, the other side of this is deaths. This would be the subtraction of population. And of course, the number of deaths peaked in 2021. We all lived through the pandemic, and we can see the elevated number of deaths in this period. 2023 has come back down to 96,000. So hopefully we're kind of through this peak for the foreseeable future. But you can see that even prior to 2010, or even before COVID, we can see that there was a steady increase in the number of deaths in Georgia. But if you look to the left of 2010, you may notice how the size of this side of the curve is a little flatter, and here it gets steeper. And so if we look at this, we can see that the slope here, which is the expected number of births year over year, or deaths increase year over year, is around 620. And then between 2010 and 2019, that slope increased to about 1,700. And so we expect the number of deaths to go up because we just have more Georgians, so that's kind of not a surprise. However, this shift in the kind of increase in the slope is largely driven by Georgia's aging population. And so not only do we have more Georgians, but we have more Georgians over the age of 65, 75, 85, et cetera, than we have in previous decades. Now, the difference between births and deaths is called natural change. If you have more births than you do deaths in a given year in a given place, then you have natural increase. If you have more deaths than you do births in a given year in a given place, you have natural decrease. And so in Georgia, as we have a declining number of births and an increasing number of deaths, you can see that our natural increase is declining. So in 2011 and 12, it was around 60,000 of natural increase. Then in the depths of the pandemic, that hit around 10,000. You can see it's bounced back up a little bit, and we kind of anticipate it's going to stay in this area for the next few years. But we have a general kind of trend pattern of lower natural increase. So that leads us to our third component of population change, which is migration. And this is using here 2023 estimates. And what you can see is that international migration has been a pretty steady contributor to Georgia's population growth throughout this period. And then, of course, it was quite low in 2021, but picked up a little bit here. And then domestic migration is really what up between 2018 and 19 through 2023 really is what propelled Georgia's growth. So that's people moving to Georgia from other states. And here we're looking at net migration. So we're looking at all the people who moved in and subtracting all the people who moved out. Now, the Census Bureau did release some updated information this year with 2024, and they revised this international migration estimate up a little bit. And so you can see actually in 2024, international migration outpaced domestic migration. However, it still both still exceed natural increase for much of this second part of the graph. And if we look in the 2020s, you can see that natural change has basically Georgia's population has increased by about 88,000 people as a result of natural change, around 205,000 people as a result of domestic migration, and around 170,000 people of international migration in the 2020s. So one thing to show about the aging population or the declining number of births is that, remember, Georgia's population increased by about 1 million people in the 2010s. Pretty much all of that growth was adult population growth. The youth population, or the population under the age of 18, was 82 people higher in the 2020 census than it was in the 2010 census. So what that's to say is that 2.4 million, if there were 2.4 million people in 2010, there were 2.4 million and 82 people under the age of 18 in the 2020 census. And so here you can really see the impact of the declining number of births and its influence on Georgia's population. Now I'm going to show you how this is kind of plays out across multiple age groups here at the same time. So if we look between 2000 and 2020, when we grew from around 8.2 million people to 10.7, you can see that we had about 3 million people under the age of 25 in 2000. That increased to around 3.4 million in 2010s, and then this barely increased to around 3.5 million Georgians under the age of 25. And then the working age population increases by about 800,000 people here, and then another 400,000 people. And then really the fastest growing segment of our population is our age 65 and older. So we had about 730,000 people age 65 and older in 2000. And by 2020, we have an estimate, we had about 1.6 million people over the age of 65. Now, if these trends hold and we have this lower fertility environment and continued migration and aging patterns, this is what we think the population of those 13.5 million Georgians in 2050 will look like, which is we'll have about 3.7 million Georgians under the age of 25, 6.5 million 25 to 64, and 3 million over 65 and older. And if we look at these as percentage distribution, so it's those same age groups, but we're just seeing how much each population group's share of the population is, you can see that shift here quite a bit, where we had about 9% of our population was 65 and older in 2000, and by 2050, we estimate that'll be around 23%. Now, it's still younger than the US, the national projections. The national projections have this around 24.5 or so percent by 2050. So kind of these are the demographics in summary, and then I'm going to step into the methods. Georgia's population growth slowed in the 2010s, but we're still among the fastest growing states in the country. Even though we're aging, we still have the 10th youngest median age. So we have a really large working age population, and our population is relatively young compared to all other states. And then we really see that its suburban and ex-urban areas are projected to experience the fastest growth in the next 20 years. So I'm going to step through how populations change. So we've already talked about this a little bit. I've showed you the numbers. Population change starts with births minus deaths. Then we draw a boundary, and there can be migration. And then the third component is what we call group quarters. And so we handle these especially in our projection method. Group quarters are places like college dorms or prisons or large group quarters where those population groups behave differently. So, for example, in Athens, if we look in Clark County, there's always a large number of 18 to 24-year-olds. However, in our method, we don't say that all those 18 and 24-year-olds are going to move into 25 through 30-year-olds. Because a lot of those people are going to move back to where they came from or move to other parts of the state or other parts of the country. And if we kept them in there and they just aged up through the curve like everybody else, then we'd have once those people hit 28, 29, 30, we'd have a lot of children being born in Athens. And so we subtract those out. I'm going to show you a little bit about the population that we use. So a census is an official count of a population. So we do those every 10, well, not me, but the US as a whole does those every 10 years. And then we also have population estimates in between those years. And so I'm going to show these kind of a step through this. And you can think of these 3 blocks as 3 blocks of time. And so let's say there's census in time 1. We can do a census in time 2. Anything in between there, we need to estimate the population. So anything between 2010 and 2020, we need to estimate. And then anything between the latest census and today, we also have to estimate the population. And then anything between today out into the future, we need to estimate. So these are all 3 different kinds of estimates. And what the Census Bureau refers to these as is these are intercensal population estimates. So this is the period between 2 different censuses. We also then have post-censal. So that's kind of where we're at now, where we get the vintage 2024 estimates, which are building off of our latest one. And then anything from the latest estimates that we have or today out into the future is a projection. And so you can see here, this is kind of a breakdown of that right now. So this is 2010 census, 2020 census, and then we're using the most recent data we have, which is July 1st, 2024. And then we project that out into 2060. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the method, or a little bit more about the method, and then I'll wrap up. I think I'm right at time. So we use what's called a cohort component method, or a version of it, which is a pretty standard method of population projections. It's used by the Census Bureau. It's used by many other states. And so what a cohort, a component is when we think about cohorts, we're thinking about 3 different groups. We're thinking about race groups, so Black, white, Hispanic, and all other race groups. We're thinking about sex, male and female, and then we're thinking about age, which is 0 through 100. And then when we think about components, those are what I just walked through with you. So we're thinking about births, deaths, and migration. So for each of the cohorts, they have, how did they behave across each component? And then we think about that at whatever geography. We can either think about that at the state level or at the county level. And in Georgia, we have 159. And so while it looks like we just kind of got 7 different metrics here, that's true. But then when you break it all out and start adding these out, the matrix gets pretty large pretty quick. And so ultimately what we're doing when we create population projections is we're looking at these historical cohorts and these historical components at these different geographies. And so in order to do our population projection, we're taking a fertility rate for each of those cohorts. We're taking a mortality rate for each of those cohorts. And then we're taking a net migration rate for each of those cohorts. And we're evaluating those historically and then using our best estimation of what it will look like in the future. And then we just subtract group quarters out and add those back in. So here's some assumptions that we use when we project those rates. And so we calculate age-specific and tempo-adjusted fertility rates, meaning we try to account for that change we saw in 20-year-olds having fewer children, where we see a continued decline in that age group, but we also see an increase in the older age group. When you add that up, we get what's called a total fertility rate. Replacement rate, which is kind of a crude term that demographers use, is considered 2.1. That would mean if each woman had 2.1 children, the population would replace itself. In Georgia, we have a TFR of around 1.65 right now, and we project that to across all race groups to trend towards 1.55 over the projection horizon. We also then look at age, race, and sex-specific mortality rates. So from 0 to 85 or to 100, what's the historical mortality rate for each of those age groups? And that allows us to catch things like infant mortality, but then once you sort of make it past age 2, you got a pretty good shot until you're at an older age group and that grows up. And then for migration, we calculate what's called residual migration using Census Bureau population estimates and some refinements we make to that. And then we look at county level and regional rates in the cases, especially of small counties, where sometimes we apply regional rates to that. So with that, I will pause and be happy to take some questions from the audience.
Hey, Taylor, this is Kristen. So there's a couple things in the chat I wanted to check in with you on first. The first comment was about the prison population, how that affects the growth in some of the counties. And you had mentioned the group quarters. Can you describe specifically, I think you said you subtract them out. Can you explain that a little more?
Sure. So let's say you're in a county with 10,000 people and 1,000 of those people are living in a prison facility. Basically, when we started our base, we would subtract out those 1,000 people because with the idea that they behave differently than the rest of the population that isn't living in a group quarter facility. And then we run the scenarios or run the rates for the 9,000 people that are remaining. And then for each year, then we just add the 1,000 back in. And we had like a little bit of noise to that, but very, very little. And so we keep that pretty consistent over time.
Okay. The next one also, I think about group quarters. Isn't it true that the 18 to 24-year-olds in college towns are regularly replaced by new 18 to 24-year-olds?
Totally. So yeah, for sure. So that's the same idea of subtracting them out, right? And so those basically, if you think about it in two steps, so 18 to 20, the 24-year-old is going to become a 20 in the next year, in the next projection, they're going to be 25 and then they'll be 26 2 years down the road, and then they'll be 27. We basically say that those people don't age to the same level that a 24-year-old would and living in another place onto the next age group. So we're just subtracting them out. But by adding them back into the next year, we're just estimating a consistent number of that group.
Okay. And I think that would apply to another comment here about military bases.
Same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So all those group quarters, we're treating those the same way.
So some of the other questions are about, I want to step back to, so one of our council members said, interesting methodology and metrics. It's a shame they don't reflect reality. And Phil, do you want to comment a little more specifically on that so that maybe Taylor can try to respond?
Well, the reality we keep showing in the last 15 years that my home county is losing population. And in the decade that I've served on the planning commission, with the number of homes that have been approved and being built, it doesn't face the metrics that are being presented to us as a water council. So that's the reason I make that comment.
So do you want to tell Taylor which county you're talking about?
That is Liberty County on the coast. I am a member of the Coastal Georgia Water Planning Council.
Gotcha. Thanks. Taylor, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I don't know the Liberty County projection off the top of my head. I don't believe that what we have, if I was to share my screen here, if we were to look, I believe we got Liberty right here. So based off of the 2010 to 2020, Liberty County did increase, and it's increased since 2000 as well. McIntosh County did decline, which is kind of interesting, but McIntosh County is a special place. with a lot of federally owned land. So I think we kind of have two things to keep in mind as well. So this, we're looking at historical data, right? So when we use historical data, we don't produce our own estimates. So in the case of Liberty County, it does show that it's increasing historically. But if you were in a county that wasn't growing, let's say, and you felt that it was between today and the past 20 years, for example, we're relying on Census Bureau estimates for those. So there's not a lot we can change on that front. But I also, in terms of when we project out into the future, we're trying to, I'd have to double check to see what Liberty County's projections are, and I could talk with you offline, but I don't think we have them declining population moving forward.
All right. Well, Taylor, you mentioned McIntosh County. They're next door to us, and you said
Yeah.
they have a lot of federal land. 1/3 of Liberty County is also federal land, and we're showing growth. And McIntosh has a lot of restricted land that is not under federal, but also under state control. So there's not a large area to grow a population.
Sure.
And their decline was due to the closing of prisons in the county a decade ago. So that's what's driven your numbers that direction.
Fair point. I was being a little general, but yeah, I recognize it's more than just the federal land. Thank you for your comment.
So there's a number of questions now. I see one from Brent Howell, and I think it relates to one from Brooke Anderson, which is that the data presented, so you presented data today, an overall picture of Georgia, but can you talk about how you're looking at things going on in specific regions? I think particularly with respect to economic growth in, say, the coastal area or up in the mountains.
Let's see. I'm trying to read all these questions.
Mhm.
I think so. We produce projections for each county. The goal today was to give you all an overarching trend of what the state projections are, but each county's projections about age, race, and sex are available on the OPB website. So you're definitely able to go check those out.
Mhm.
If we're talking about the coast specifically, and perhaps large economic development projects,
Mhm.
so what we do is we assume a higher migration rate in the future than what we've observed in recent years, in a place like that, but we don't have an input for anticipated jobs. And one example might be anticipated jobs are a tricky thing because anticipated jobs don't always come to fruition. So we wait until, one of the reasons we do them so frequently is because we're using the data that we're getting in order to produce the projections. I don't know if that answers your question. There's several here, but I was trying to scan
Yeah, I was
through
gonna
them and aggregate.
circle back
So
to a few of them,
Taylor,
but I think I hear somebody commenting. Go ahead.
hey, Taylor, this is Brooke Anderson. So when I asked the first question about the time periods, when you look at your death, migration, births, and all that, you typically look at a span of time that you are looking at the percentages of each of those. So what is your span of time? Is that 5 years in the rear? Is that 5 months in the rear? And what time frame is that? Is it a 5-year time frame? Is it a 3-year time frame? And
Sure.
does it slide horizontally as you do additional projections?
So what we do for, let's see, does it slide for additional projections? I would say, so for fertility and mortality, what we're doing is we're looking at the 2000 to the most recent data. However, in the case of mortality, what we've done is take out the years of COVID-19. Because of the elevated number of deaths that we saw in those years, we didn't feel that was representative moving forward. So we're taking a 20-year trend in both fertility and mortality, aside from the strangeness of mortality in COVID-19. And then in migration, in some cases migration is a very tricky thing, right? To to calculate. And so in some cases, we're taking that long view of 20 years. So if you've had a sustained pattern of consistent decline or consistent growth that's been consistent, I'm just over saying consistent, for 20 years, then we would take that longer approach. If you're in a place like the coastal region that's seen steady growth, I would say a departure from what we saw 20 years ago, and more growth, then we'd look at a more recent migration rate and apply that.
Okay,
Brooke, can I just interrupt for a second? Because there was one question we skipped over and I kind of wanted to walk through them, how they're coming in.
Sure.
Okay, I'll come back to you in just a second. How is the legal immigration population calculated, Taylor?
So again, we use the census estimates that are produced by the U.S. Census Bureau. And the census estimates goal is to count people where they live, regardless of citizenship status. And so as I showed y'all, the revisions that they made, the Census Bureau were made to international immigration or international migration between 24 and 23 estimates. Those would now be reflected in the totals for the next round of projections.
Okay, good. And I know Brooke's next question is why do you update the projections annually?
That is our contract with OPB.
okay, so, but why? That's great, but why?
I
Why
don't,
do
that might be
people-
something Taylor can't answer, but we could probably pursue that with OPB and just giving Taylor a little bit of support there that he
Yeah.
might.
Sorry, Taylor, I don't mean to beat on you. So you got it figured out, but so the challenge is that you're dealing with a bunch of water folks here, and we play the long game, and we play it every day. And when we are looking at water supply and water and meeting the needs of our communities, some of those projects take 20 years. And the erratic nature of some of y'all projections have been challenging for us. As an example, between 22 and 24, Dawson County was the fourth, fifth, and first fastest growing county in the nation, but yet you have our population decreasing by 21,000 people. And so I don't understand how we can be the fastest growing county in the nation, but how our population projections are decreasing. And so when we look at these things, it's a killer. And I know you're not in our world, and I'm a little bit animated, but you know, we gotta understand the context. And when you look at, you know, your population projection for Dawson County in 2023 was 67,900 people, and in 24 it was 46,900. And so, do you look back? Do y'all look at how your numbers are shaking out, and you know, year over year? Because in the water world, we cannot tolerate these types of ping pong effects on these population projections. They don't work for what we do for a living.
Sure, I hear you. I'd be happy to talk specifics of Dawson County with you offline. I don't think we project Dawson County's population to decline by 21,000 over the next horizon. But I'd be happy to look more closely and make sure that you're getting the right data that you need from us. I do think if you go back to maybe the 2015 projections, you know, 10 years ago, there was much more conventional. The conventional wisdom was that coming out of the Great Recession, that fertility rates would rebound and that we'd approach back to 2.0 or 2.1 over the period, which would increase kind of everybody's population projections. So our statewide projections, I can say, are a little bit lower today than they were 10 years ago. But that's largely because of the assumptions of fertility. But that's kind of a general response to your question, but I'd be happy to talk specifics with you another time. And I mean, I guess I'll just say, one other thing is one of my goals of reaching out to EPD and Kristen and folks was that I'd like to answer these questions for y'all in advance as opposed to just answering them at the end when y'all are upset with me and team. So that's kind of the goal of today, is to hopefully open a little bit of a dialogue so that y'all know who I am and can ask me questions and make sure you understand at least what's going on, hopefully.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we're
and I-
really grateful for
And I
that.
guess I'll say that's not to say that we'll always agree and that, we're gonna, that we'll always be able to make you happy. I can't promise you that, but we do want to listen.
Yeah, we're really
well, and I
grateful
appreciate
for
you being on
Taylor's
here, Taylor,
engagement.
if we need you to input.
Yeah, and Brooke, I know you have a number of questions, and I just want to point out to you that we're going to be able to dig into some of the county level stuff in the fall meetings with Taylor and his associates from Carl Vinson. So know that this isn't the last opportunity, because I do want to acknowledge that we only have about 9 minutes left. So Brooke, if it's okay, I just want to skip to Benji's question because I think it's more general, and then we can circle back to some of your more specific methods questions. Would that be all right with you?
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks, Brooke. Hold on a second then. Benji asked, for regions that are acting differently, like the coastal area, do you talk with local folks to get qualitative information to support your projections?
I would say currently that is differed at different times, as I understand it, over the past 10 years in our relationship with OPB. Currently, the last few years, that has not been a focus. We do, at the Institute of Government, have folks who are all over the state working regularly, and so we do have kind of an internal review of a much wider team. But I would also say we've just brought on a team member with qualitative background, who I think we're trying to think through these questions of how can we understand perceptions of growth recently in relationship to the official statistics that we get from the Census Bureau. Now, the tricky part of that is too, that doesn't mean we can do in-depth interviews with all 159 counties every year. So there's a balance we have to strike on that front, just from a resource perspective. But point taken, and we try to use as much local and statewide knowledge that we have to try to inform everything that we do.
Good. Couple of nice comments to Taylor in the chat. Just to note, it's not personal. We know your job is difficult, and that the data today is better than what we started with in 2009. And thank you for doing this.
Yeah.
I want to move back to, I see a new comment from Mickey. I know we're not going to be able to get to all these, but Brooke, I don't want to skip over yours either.
You're good, Christian. Keep going. I'll
Okay.
catch up later.
All right. Okay. I thought your deaths question was interesting. So Mickey asks, Kia has continued to have growth in secondary and tertiary suppliers. So I think this is a continuation of the looking for this local input on economic growth. How can you consider that?
I think that goes back a little bit to what I was saying a little bit. We have folks who are working with Georgia Department of Economic Development, local economic development groups to try to be aware of these sort of things. I will say, just candidly, one of the tricky parts about that is if you're in a community who's not having a lot of economic development, then you could get penalized if we influence that too much. And so that's one thing we want to be mindful of too, because there are large economic development projects, but there's also a lot of organic growth and decline that one of the reasons we do them as frequently as we do, I guess, to go back to Brooke's question, is to try to capture as much of that in the data as we can. And so we try to be aware of those things and totally agree that one plant brings about other employers, et cetera, and those things change or influence growth rates. And so, yeah, I'd say fair point. I don't have a specific answer for you.
Circling back to Brooke's questions, how do you look at county to county migration?
So that's tricky. So we're generally looking at in-migration and out-migration at the county level. Now, we don't necessarily know in that case did a person move from Banks County to Jackson County? What we know in that case is that we don't look at it at that level. What we do look at it and say, is Jackson County experiencing in-migration? And that's independent of if Banks County looks at it. Now, in some of the smaller counties, we do use like really small populated, we do use a regional migration schedule. So if you say a place, for example, like Columbus is a large urban center, especially in the region that it's in, sometimes those other counties, maybe an aggregate of them, is a better interpretation than the single county itself, because there's just so much noise in that data.
There's one question here about so if Georgia's the 10th youngest state, why are we dying off at the same rate as the rest of the country?
I'm not sure of that question. I think if we look at mortality rates, at least of the Southeast, which is where usually where we do most of our comparisons, Georgia has a lower mortality rate than pretty much all other states in the Southeast. It could be, if you're looking at an age-adjusted mortality rate, which is a metric you can do, which would control for the population size. On that case, we might have or doesn't control for the population size, controls for the age structure of the population. If you've seen a figure like that, then we might have a similar pattern, but I'd have to look a little bit closer. But just if we look at overall, we do have lower mortality rates than our neighbors. And that's a slide I sometimes present, but didn't include it today.
The last question of Brooks we didn't really get to talk about yet is that when you're starting your next round of projections, are you looking at the prior round to see how it did and considering where things might have gone off before?
We do. We definitely do. We look at previous rounds. I will say my goal is always to produce the best projection we can for the county at that time. But yeah, we evaluate it in relationship to last year's as well.
Great. So just 2 minutes left. Another nice comment from Mickey here, appreciating your work. We all really appreciate your willingness to do this up front, and I think it's going to make a big difference in how well we understand it and how much we can give you some input before the next round and ways to make this useful to the water planning councils. I really appreciate your time, and just want to note to the council members that the next step is going to be that we're going to have some fall meetings, joint council meetings with other councils, and I'll be in touch soon about dates for those. We're looking at September and October for that time period for these meetings. You'll hear about that soon. And at those meetings, we'll dig more into the county level data from the 2025 projections to talk about those with Taylor and his associates. Again, those are the ones we'll use for the next round of planning, but it is a good opportunity for us to look at really recent numbers and discuss those with Carl Vinson. And then the other thing I'll mention is just that survey. If you haven't had a chance to do it yet, there's the link on the screen, and we appreciate your input. So thanks for everybody's time today. And thank you very much, Taylor. We appreciate your sharing your knowledge with us today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank y'all for having me.